Prologue shadows over the continent. The year is 1943. Europe burns. Over the gray, endless expanse of the continent, the Luftwaffe rules the air. Its fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, slice through the sky like predators that have never known fear. Allied bombers, lumbering and exposed, are slaughtered by the dozens. In England, American airmen stare at the mission boards each dawn, reading lists of squadrons that never returned. The 8th Air Force was still young, still learning. Its pilots were brave, but the tools in their hands, the early P-38 Lightnings and P-39 Airacobras, lacked the range and altitude to challenge the German masters above Europe. Then, from the Republic Aviation Plant in Farmingdale, Long Island, a new design arrived, huge, heavy, and, to many, absurd. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Even before it reached combat, the jokes began. British pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. Though others snickered it looked more like a milk jug with wings. American ground crews stared in disbelief at its size. 7 tons of metal, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire. And somewhere in a German officer's mess, laughter echoed when the first intelligence photos arrived. Too heavy, too slow, Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland supposedly remarked. If that is what the Americans are sending, then we have nothing to fear. Chapter 1: The Monster Takes Flight. The P-47 was the brainchild of a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli, a man who believed that survival in aerial combat depended not on elegance, but on power. His design philosophy was brutally simple. Build a plane around the biggest, most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, and wrap it in armor thick enough to bring the pilot home. To accommodate that beast of an engine, Kartveli created a fuselage so wide that traditional fighter pilots scoffed. But inside that metal shell lay innovation. A turbo-supercharger system that could hurl the Thunderbolt to 30,000 feet, maintaining full power where German engines gasped for oxygen. It was the first American fighter truly capable of escorting bombers at high altitude, at least on paper. Early test flights proved it could dive faster than any plane before it, almost 500 miles per hour in a steep descent. But at takeoff, pilots cursed it. The long nose hid the runway, the engine torque pulled violently to the left, and its heavy frame demanded long runways. Some crashed before ever leaving the ground. Still, the Army Air Forces pressed forward. War waits for no perfection. Chapter 2: The Baptism of Fire. April 1943. From bases in England, the first P-47 units, the 56th Fighter Group among them, prepared to cross the Channel. Their mission: escort B-17s deep into occupied France. Pilots climbed into cockpits that smelled of new paint and engine oil. The roar of the Double Wasp filled the airfield, shaking hangars. Mechanics covered their ears. To many, it felt like strapping themselves atop a locomotive rather than an aircraft. Over France, they met the Luftwaffe. The German fighters came diving from above, silver flashes descending from the sun. The Thunderbolt pilots tried to turn to meet them, but the big American fighter bled energy in tight maneuvers. The Messerschmitts circled them like wolves. That first combat ended badly. 3 Thunderbolts failed to return. The Luftwaffe barely noticed the losses. They called the new American fighter, like Zu Fangen, easy to catch. In Luftwaffe-ready rooms, confidence grew. The Americans, it seemed, had built a flying barn. Chapter 3: Inside the 56th. Among those who flew that first mission was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a quiet, square-jawed Oklahoman who'd spent his youth staring at contrails high above the plains. He was 22, green, and determined to prove that the Jug could fight. First, he hated it. The cockpit view was poor, the climb rate sluggish. If you're jumped, he wrote in his journal, you'd better dive, because you sure can't outturn anything. But then came the first surprise. Johnson found that when he pushed the throttle and pointed the nose down, the Thunderbolt didn't just dive. It fell like a thunderbolt from the heavens. No aircraft in Europe could match its terminal velocity. German pilots who tried to follow sometimes found their wings ripped off by the pressure of the dive. It was a discovery that would soon change tactics across the 8th Air Force. Chapter 4: The Sound of Thunder. By mid-1943, The roar of the P-47's engine had become familiar to the English countryside. Farmers looked up and waved as formations of jugs climbed toward the channel. Their massive propellers churned the air, leaving spiraling trails that glittered in the morning sun. Inside each cockpit, the pilot sat encased in steel armor, surrounded by 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. When fired together, they hurled 100 rounds per second, creating what pilots called a wall of lead. Still, skepticism persisted. The British preferred their nimble Spitfires. The Germans still mocked the Jug as the flying oil drum. And within the American ranks, pilots of lighter fighters sneered that Thunderbolt men were truck drivers with wings. Then came June 26, 1943, Chapter 5, Johnson's Miracle. That day, Lieutenant Robert Johnson and his flight took off from England to escort bombers over France. The mission seemed routine until German fighters appeared, FW-190s, fast and deadly. Johnson's squadron engaged. The sky turned into chaos, spirals of smoke, flashes of tracers, the hammering roar of machine guns. Johnson's P-47 shuddered. Rounds ripped through the fuselage. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his goggles. A shell struck his engine. Smoke filled the cockpit. The canopy jammed shut. He was trapped. Another FW-190, flown by an ace named Egbert Fall, appeared behind him and opened fire. Johnson's aircraft was torn apart. Over 200 bullet holes, the engine coughing, the controls sluggish. Somehow, impossibly, the Jug refused to die. For minutes, the German ace circled, pouring round after round into the crippled P-47, watching in disbelief as it kept flying. Finally, out of ammunition, he saluted and broke off. Johnson limped back across the channel. His landing gear wouldn't deploy. He crash-landed on his belly. When the mechanics counted the hits, they found the engine had taken a direct cannon strike that should have destroyed it. Yet the massive double Wasp still turned, still pulled its pilot home. Word spread fast. The laughter in Luftwaffe mess halls grew quieter. Chapter 6, The Turning of the Tide. By late summer 1943, Thunderbolt groups had learned new tactics, no dogfighting, no turning duels. The Jug was a hammer, not a rapier. They would climb high, attack from above, unleash 8 streams of .50 caliber fire, and dive away before the enemy could react. The results were devastating. In one engagement near Rouen, P-47s dove on a formation of Messerschmitts and annihilated them in seconds. Wreckage littered the countryside. German survivors reported the Americans appeared out of nowhere, guns flashing like lightning. At high altitude, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine gave it a speed edge that shocked the Germans. Suddenly, the big American fighter could outclimb and outdive everything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. The laughter stopped entirely. Chapter 7, The Fear Begins. In Luftwaffe intelligence briefings, new words began to appear. Vorsicht vor Thunderbolt. Beware the Thunderbolt. Pilots whispered of the American fighter that could take impossible punishment, that could dive straight down and live. Ground troops, hearing the distant rumble of its engine, began calling it Der Donnerbomber. By autumn, Thunderbolts were fitted with bombs and rockets attacking trains, trucks, and airfields. What began as an air-to-air escort fighter was becoming a terror from above. For the first time, German soldiers on the ground developed a psychological condition the Allies would later document, Jabo fever, or fighter-bomber fever. The sound of approaching P-47s sent men running for cover before they even saw them. Chapter 8, The Thunder Grows Louder. Republic's factories worked day and night. By 1944, 15,000 Thunderbolts would roll out of assembly lines, each an ironclad promise that American industry could outbuild German genius. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. In the skies over France, the balance of power was shifting. Yet for every victory, the Thunderbolt pilots remembered how it began, with laughter, with ridicule, with German aces pointing skyward and grinning. No one was laughing now. Closing of Section 1. As winter 1943 settled over Europe, the roar of the Thunderbolt became the heartbeat of Allied air power. Its legend was only beginning. The pilots who once doubted it now trusted it with their lives. And the men who mocked it now prayed never to meet it in the sky again. "She may be ugly," Robert Johnson would later say, standing beside his battered jug, "but she's beautiful to me." Chapter 1: The Blueprint of Defiance. Long before it was feared over Europe, before its engines shook the skies of France, the P-47 Thunderbolt existed only as a stubborn dream, one man's refusal to accept limits. That man was Alexander Kartveli. Born Alexander Kartvelishvili in Tbilisi, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire, Kartveli fled after the Bolshevik Revolution. He arrived in America in the 1920s, penniless but carrying blueprints in his head. To him, airplanes were the future of survival and power. At Republic Aviation, he would design machines that embodied that belief. By 1940, with Europe already in flames, the U.S. Army Air Corps came to Republic with a request. "We need a fighter that can reach 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Kartveli's eyes lit up. He didn't want to build just a fighter. He wanted to build a fortress that could fight back and live to tell the tale. He began sketching a frame so large it dwarfed everything on the drafting tables of the time. Engineers scoffed. The airframe looked closer to a light bomber than a nimble interceptor. Yet in Kartveli's mind, size meant endurance, and endurance meant victory. At its heart, he placed the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower radial engine. To feed it air at high altitudes, he added a revolutionary General Electric turbo supercharger, tucked deep into the fuselage with long exhaust ducts running beneath the cockpit. The result was unconventional. A plane that looked overweight, over-engineered, and overconfident. But the blueprint promised something unseen before. Speed, altitude, and durability combined in one machine. Chapter 2: The Prototype, XP-47B. In early 1941, as Britain fought alone and America edged toward war, Republic began assembling the first prototype, the XP-47B. Workers at the Farmingdale plant marveled at its scale. The fuselage stretched over 30 feet. The wings spanned more than 40. Fully loaded, it weighed over 10,000 pounds, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter ever conceived. When Kartveli walked through the hangar, mechanics stared as if he were building a monster. One of them muttered, "She'll never leave the ground." But on May 6, 1941, test pilot Lowell "Lanky" Smith climbed into the cockpit and took the XP-47B up for its maiden flight. The takeoff run seemed endless. The engine thundered like a storm, and for a heartbeat, it looked like the critics were right. Then, slowly, the great beast lifted. Smith climbed to 15,000 feet, leveled off and radioed down, "Tell Alex she flies, and she flies fast. Top speed, 412 miles per hour. Kartveli smiled faintly. He had proven his point. Chapter 3: The Battle Before the Battle. Despite its performance, the Air Corps had doubts. The XP-47B was expensive, complex, and guzzled fuel. Logistics officers warned that its massive frame would strain transport and maintenance resources. But the world was changing fast. After Pearl Harbor, America was in the war. The Army needed a fighter that could escort bombers across enemy territory, something with range and altitude to reach Berlin someday. The Thunderbolt's size, once seen as a flaw, suddenly became its greatest promise. It could carry fuel, guns, and armor in quantities no other fighter could match. Republic received an initial order for 773 aircraft, a colossal gamble for a design still untested in combat. Kartveli worked day and night, personally inspecting each assembly line. He knew that the smallest weakness in the Thunderbolt structure could mean the difference between a pilot's life or death. He reinforced the cockpit with steel plates, installed self-sealing fuel tanks, and demanded that no component fail at high G-forces. "You must understand," he told his team, "a man's life will sit behind every bolt we drive." By early 1942, the first production P-47B models rolled out, a sight of pure industrial muscle, polished aluminum glinting beneath the factory lights. Chapter 4: Baptized in Training. The Thunderbolt's first pilots were not impressed. Young lieutenants, fresh from flight school, climbed into the new machines and were stunned by the weight of the controls. On the runway, the torque from the massive propeller tried to yank the plane sideways. If a pilot wasn't careful, he'd veer off the tarmac before even lifting off. In flight, the Thunderbolt felt sluggish at low altitude. It took patience to coax her into a climb. But once she reached 20,000 feet, she came alive. The turbo supercharger whined, the engine roared, and the plane surged forward with the raw energy of a hurricane. Test reports began to reflect a change in tone. Handles poorly below 10,000 feet, but above that, performance is outstanding. Dives faster than anything we have. One instructor wrote, "She's not a lady like the Spitfire. She's a brawler. Treat her rough. She likes it." The P-47 wasn't built for finesse. It was built to survive. Chapter 5: Engineering of Immortality. To understand why the P-47 would later terrify the Luftwaffe, one must understand its engineering, a marvel of wartime design. Armor. Over 300 pounds of steel plating shielded the cockpit and engine. Bullets that would shred other fighters merely dented the Jug's skin. Self-sealing fuel tanks. Layers of vulcanized rubber swelled when hit, closing bullet holes and preventing explosions. Engine resilience. The air-cooled double wasp could lose cylinders, oil pressure, even partial cooling, and still run. Control redundancy. Dual cables and hydraulic backups allowed the pilot to maintain command even with severe damage. The plane's center of gravity was placed deliberately low, making it nearly impossible to enter an unrecoverable spin. In short, the P-47 could take a beating that would send other aircraft spiraling into the ground, and still make it home. These features made it heavier, slower to climb, and ungainly on the ground, but in war, elegance doesn't win battles. Survival does. Chapter 6: From Blueprints to Belief. Republic's factory workforce expanded into the tens of thousands. Engineers, welders, and women riveters working around the clock. They nicknamed the factory floor the Forge. Posters lined the walls. "Build it strong. A pilot's life depends on it." Every rivet, every weld, every gun mounting was treated as sacred duty. America was at war, and this was how ordinary hands could strike back. Outside, the world burned. In Europe, Allied bombers were slaughtered by the Luftwaffe's elite. The Thunderbolt was being shipped across the Atlantic, destined for English fields where young Americans waited to see whether this hulking machine would save their friends or get them killed. When the first P-47s arrived in Britain in December 1942, mechanics stood in awe. Compared to the slender Spitfires beside them, the Jugs looked like armored giants. The Royal Air Force officers exchanged glances of skepticism. One murmured, "They're sending tractors to do a Greyhound's work." They didn't know yet that the tractor would soon plow through the Luftwaffe like a storm. Chapter 7: Early Trials over England. In January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group, under the command of Colonel Hub Zemke, received their first P-47CS. Zemke was a hard-edged, analytical leader, the kind of man who studied his enemy as carefully as his aircraft. At first, his pilots hated the Jug. The radio systems failed at altitude, the range was disappointing, and the climb rate was poor compared to the German fighters they expected to meet. Zemke listened to their complaints, then made them study the aircraft. He taught them to dive instead of turn, to use speed and altitude, not agility. He drilled them on discipline, energy management, and teamwork. "Your plane can outdive anything the Germans fly," he told them. "You get one pass, you hit hard, and you get out. Never dogfight a 109. Make him chase you. He won't live long enough to regret it." Zemke's faith in the P-47 was unshakable. His men began to believe him. Chapter 8: A Beast Unleashed. By spring 1943, Thunderbolts filled the skies of southern England. They gleamed like chrome thunderheads under the cold sunlight. The 8th Air Force prepared for its first long-range missions into occupied Europe. Every pilot felt the weight of history. They were about to prove whether the P-47 was a blunder or a masterpiece. In German intelligence briefings, photos of the new American fighter circulated. Analysts noted its thickness, its radial engine, and concluded it was inferior to the FW-190 at all altitudes. One officer scrawled in the margin, Target should be simple to engage. Heavy, slow, large. The stage was set for humiliation, but not the kind the Germans expected. Soon, their mockery would echo over smoking airfields and shattered rail lines. The monster was awake. End of section 2. The world was about to discover that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the flying milk jug, was no laughing matter. In the next section, its guns would speak, and its legend would begin to burn itself into the skies of Europe. Chapter 1: Baptism over France. April 8, 1943. Dawn broke cold and pale over the English countryside. Rows of P-47s stood lined along the tarmac at Halesworth Airfield, their aluminum skins gleaming under the floodlights. Ground crews scurried between them, fueling, arming, wiping frost from the canopies. Mechanics cursed through their breath as the smell of oil and aviation fuel hung heavy in the air. Captain Hub Zemke watched from the edge of the runway, his flight helmet under his arm. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the horizon. He knew the enemy well. The Luftwaffe wasn't just skilled. It was supremely confident. German aces had honed their craft since the Spanish Civil War, while many of his own pilots had never even seen combat. Inside one of those silver jugs, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson tightened his harness. His heart pounded. He had trained for months for this day, but nothing truly prepared a man for his first dive into the unknown. The engines roared to life, deep, throaty, violent. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 came alive like a beast unchained, shaking the ground. The sound rolled across the field, a mechanical thunder that rattled windows for miles. Zemke gave the signal. The P-47s surged down the runway, one after another, climbing into the cloudy morning sky. Their mission: to escort B-17 bombers on a sweep over Rouen, France, deep into Luftwaffe territory. Their objective: protect the bombers. Test the Thunderbolt's wings in real combat. Chapter 2: First Blood. At 20,000 feet, the formation crossed the French coast. The English Channel below looked deceptively calm, its steel-gray waves rippling like polished metal. Johnson glanced across his wing. 12 Thunderbolts flying in formation, sunlight glinting off their canopies. Ahead, the bomber stream glittered like silver arrows cutting through the sky. Then, radio chatter crackled in his headset. Bandits 11 o'clock high. Dozens of them. The Luftwaffe had arrived. Black specks appeared against the glare of the sun, FW-190s, diving in formation. The Germans came with practiced precision, the way hunters close in on wounded prey. Tracer rounds streaked past the formation, white-hot lines of death. Johnson's squadron scattered. The sky erupted into chaos, the first Thunderbolt air battle of the war. The P-47 pilots struggled to adapt. Used to lighter aircraft, many tried to turn-fight the German aces, a fatal mistake. The Thunderbolt, massive and heavy, lost energy too quickly in tight turns. Within minutes, 2 American fighters were burning, spiraling toward the ground. "They're too damn fast," one pilot shouted. "They're on us before we can blink." Zemke's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't turn. Dive. Use the jug's weight." Johnson shoved the throttle forward, pushed the nose down, and the Thunderbolt responded with a scream. The airspeed indicator climbed. 400 mph. For 50. For 75. The wind howled. The controls stiffened. But the jug held together. A Messerschmitt tried to follow. Couldn't. The German pilot's wings began to flutter. He broke off, pulling out desperately before the pressure tore his plane apart. Johnson leveled out, heart hammering. For the first time, he understood the jug's power, not grace, but raw, merciless momentum. The Thunderbolt had found its purpose. Chapter 3: Hard Lessons. The mission was a tactical failure. Several bombers were lost, and the Thunderbolts, still learning their craft, claimed few victories. But they learned how to fight. Back at base, Zemke gathered his men. He drew 2 circles on a chalkboard, one small, one large. "This," he said, pointing to the small one, "is the turn radius of a 109. This," he tapped the larger one, "is yours. You can't beat them like this. But he drew a vertical line. You can beat them like this. He meant altitude and speed, the Thunderbolt strengths. Attack from above, fire, and dive away before the enemy could react. Never fight on their terms. It became known as the Zemke fan, a system of layered, energy-based attack formations that used the Jug's brute force instead of finesse. Within months, it would turn the 56th Fighter Group into one of the most feared units in the skies. Still, in those early days, the cost was brutal. Many young pilots died before the tactic solidified, men who never lived to see what the Jug would become. One pilot, Lieutenant William Dunham, wrote home, "She's a handful, this beast, but if you treat her right, she'll bring you home." We're learning, slowly, the hard way. Chapter 4, The Fearless Few. Combat over France grew fiercer each week. By May 1943, the Luftwaffe's elite, JG-2, Richthofen, and JG-26, Schlagiter, were intercepting Allied raids daily. These squadrons were filled with battle-hardened veterans, men who had dominated the skies for years. The Americans were the newcomers, bold, brave, but inexperienced. Yet something began to change. Reports filtered in from German pilots who had engaged the P-47s. They spoke with grudging respect of its speed in a dive, of how it could absorb punishment like nothing else they'd seen. One ace reportedly said, "We shoot at them until our guns are empty, and they keep flying." By early summer, Luftwaffe Command issued internal memos urging pilots to avoid extended chases with Thunderbolts at high altitude. The Americans had found a weapon that could match the vaunted FW-190 above 25,000 feet, something the British Spitfires struggled to do. For the first time, the hunters were beginning to feel hunted. Chapter 5, The Sound of Survival. Thunderbolt pilots began to understand that their best weapon wasn't just their guns. It was their durability. If they could survive the first few seconds of surprise attack, they could almost always bring the Jug home. Lieutenant Francis Gabby Gabreski, one of Zemke's men, recalled, "When the fight started, you didn't panic. You pushed that nose down and ran. The Jug could dive like the wrath of God. You came back around and picked them off one by one." Pilots began experimenting, using their 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns not for accuracy, but for area saturation. A short burst could shred a target's wings clean off. The recoil shook the whole airframe, the tracers glowing like fiery chains across the sky. When a formation of Thunderbolts opened fire together, it sounded like thunder cracking the heavens, earning the plane its fearsome name in both Allied and Axis radio chatter alike.
Achtung! Donnerbolzen oben.
Attention! Thunderbolts above. Chapter 6, A Miracle in the Sky. June 26, 1943. The day Robert Johnson would enter legend. On that mission, Johnson's flight engaged a swarm of German fighters near Royami, France. The fight was chaotic, deadly, fast. Before he even saw the enemy, his Jug took hits. Cannon shells tearing through the fuselage, the canopy cracking. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his goggles. His left wing was shredded. He tried to bail out, but the canopy jammed. Smoke filled the cockpit. His controls felt dead. Below him, the French countryside spun in a dizzy blur. A German FW-190, piloted by Ace Egbert Fall, appeared behind him. Fall opened fire, short, precise bursts. More shells slammed into Johnson's aircraft, punching holes in the wings, ripping away panels. Johnson braced for the end, but the Jug didn't die. Somehow, impossibly, the engine still ran. The propeller still turned. The plane refused to fall. Fall, baffled, came in again, firing until his guns were empty. Johnson looked back through the shattered glass and saw the German pilot raise a hand in salute. Then Fall peeled away. With blood on his face and smoke pouring into the cockpit, Johnson limped the crippled Jug back across the channel. His landing gear wouldn't deploy. He crash-landed belly first on the runway. When the ground crew counted the bullet holes, there were over 200. One shell had passed through the engine block without detonating. The mechanics stared in disbelief. Johnson, dazed but alive, simply muttered, "She brought me home." From that day forward, the Thunderbolt's reputation was sealed. Chapter 7 The Laughing Stops. Word of Johnson's survival spread across both sides of the front. American pilots celebrated him as living proof that the Jug was unkillable. In German mess halls, laughter turned into quiet unease. Reports described Thunderbolts shrugging off hits that should have destroyed them. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, who had once mocked the aircraft, now advised caution. He later admitted in an interview, "We underestimated the Americans. The Thunderbolt was a tank that could fly and shoot." From that moment on, Luftwaffe pilots no longer joked about the flying milk bottle. They whispered about it. Chapter 8 Blood and Steel. Through the summer of 1943, Thunderbolts began to dominate the skies. They still lacked range, unable to escort bombers all the way to Germany, but within their zone of operation they reigned supreme. Each engagement taught new lessons. Don't turn fight. Attack from above. Use the dive. Never stop firing until the target disappears. The Jug's 8 machine guns tore Luftwaffe formations apart. A single Thunderbolt could unleash nearly 3,400 rounds in a mission, more than enough to disintegrate any aircraft that lingered in its sights. In just 4 months, the 56th Fighter Group scored over 150 confirmed kills, and that was only the beginning. End of Section 3. By the end of 1943, the sky over Europe was changing color, from the black crosses of the Luftwaffe to the white stars of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The Thunderbolt, once mocked as a flying barn, had proven itself an angel of vengeance, loud, brutal, unstoppable. And this was only its beginning. The laughter was gone. Now there was only the sound of thunder. Chapter 1 Wings of Faith. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt was no longer a mystery. It had proven itself in the fires of France, its reputation forged in aluminum, lead, and courage. But its greatest strength wasn't its engine or its guns. It was the men who had learned to believe in it. Across the cold, windswept airfields of England, the U.S. 8th Air Force prepared for something bigger, something that could decide the war in the air once and for all. The bombing campaign deep into the heart of Germany. The P-47s were the only American fighters capable of protecting the bombers partway in. They couldn't yet reach Berlin, their fuel tanks simply couldn't carry them that far, but their pilots refused to let that limit their resolve. Colonel Hub Zemke, the architect of Thunderbolt tactics, watched as his squadron lined up for another mission. He had seen his boys grow from nervous rookies to hardened veterans. They had scars now, some on their faces, others buried deeper. He knew many wouldn't come back. "The Germans think we're here to protect bombers," he said quietly. "They're wrong. We're here to take their skies away." Chapter 2 The Long Ride Home. One of those pilots was Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, a Polish-American with a grin that never quite hid the steel beneath. Gabreski had watched Europe burn for years, long before America joined the fight. To him, every sortie was personal. On the morning of October 8, 1943, Gabreski's squadron was tasked with escorting B-17s over Bremen. The mission went sideways almost immediately. Heavy cloud cover broke their formations apart. Then came the interceptors, dozens of FW-190s, diving like hawks. Gabreski pushed his Jug into the fight, firing bursts into the chaos. Tracers crisscrossed the sky like fiery webs. One bomber exploded in a flash. Another went down in flames. In the storm of steel and smoke, Gabreski spotted a 190 turning for another pass at the bombers. He dove, the P-47 shaking violently as the airspeed climbed. He fired just a fraction of a second's window, and the 190 disintegrated. Then, before he could pull away, another German came from behind. Cannon shells slammed into Gabreski's wing. The plane shuddered violently. He yanked the stick, dove again, 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. The earth rushed up. He pulled out just in time, skimming the cloud tops, the engine groaning but alive. He limped home on half power. When he landed, oil streaked the fuselage, holes the size of fists riddled the tail. A mechanic whistled low. "How the hell did you keep her flying?" Gabreski smiled, eyes tired. "I didn't. She kept me flying." That day, his faith in the Jug became absolute. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a guardian. Chapter 3, The Engineer's Gamble. While pilots fought over Europe, far across the Atlantic, another battle was being waged. Not in the skies, but in blueprints and boardrooms. At Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, Alexander Kartveli, the Thunderbolt's designer, sat hunched over his desk, cigarette smoke curling around his head. He was obsessed, not with what the jug was, but with what it could be. He knew its flaw range. The bombers were dying over Germany because their escorts couldn't follow them all the way in. The P-47 could outfight almost anything, but it couldn't stay in the air long enough to matter. Kartveli's solution was radical: drop tanks. External fuel tanks that could be released mid-flight. They would give the Thunderbolt the legs it needed. The idea met resistance. Some generals argued the tanks were too risky, that they'd slow the planes down or catch fire. But the engineers pressed on, testing prototype after prototype until the system worked. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt's range nearly doubled. For the first time, they could reach the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Hitler's war machine. The pilots called the tanks lifelines. The Germans called them trouble. Chapter 4, Winter over the Reich. December 1943. The European sky was a frozen hell. Snow swept across airfields. Icy winds tore through runways slick with oil and frost. But the missions never stopped. At dawn, Thunderbolt pilots climbed into their cockpits, their breath steaming inside their masks. Some tucked photos of wives or sweethearts under the instrument panel. Others carried lucky charms: a medal, a coin, a cross. One by one, the jugs lifted off, climbing through the mist. They rose into the gray, where the cold bit at their bones and the world fell away beneath the clouds. Above Germany, flak bursts painted black blossoms across the sky. The bombers flew steady, huge, lumbering targets. The Thunderbolts danced around them, intercepting any shape that dared approach. Gabreski's guns flashed. Another FW-190 burst into flame. His wingman hooped over the radio. But there was no joy in it anymore, only grim necessity. For every victory, another call sign went silent. Each empty bunk back at base told the same story. Courage bought with finality. You stopped counting kills, Gabreski would later say. You started counting names. Chapter 5, The Fan in Motion. Hub Zemke's fan formation had evolved into a deadly art. Thunderbolts now attacked in waves. A coordinated storm. The first layer dove from high altitude, scattering the enemy. The second followed, slashing through disoriented formations. The third finished whatever still moved. The sky became a theater of motion, geometry in blood and smoke. German pilots, once the undisputed masters of the air, now found themselves reacting instead of leading. Luftwaffe radio chatter recorded desperation.
Sie kommen von oben. Wieder und wieder.
They come from above. Again and again. Zemke's group alone claimed over 500 kills by early 1944, but the cost remained steep. Fuel exhaustion, flak, and surprise ambushes claimed dozens of Thunderbolts. Yet morale stayed high. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for supremacy. Chapter 6, The Day the Sky Burned. January 11, 1944. A date seared into the memories of every man who flew that day. The mission: a full-scale bombing assault on Ostersleben, Germany, one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Weather reports were grim, but orders came anyway. The bombers would go. The fighters would follow. As the formation crossed into enemy airspace, visibility dropped to near zero. Ice formed on wings. Radio static drowned half the chatter. Then the flak began. Black clouds of shrapnel tore through the formations. A B-17 exploded directly ahead, pieces scattering across the formation like confetti of death. Gabreski and Zemke both led their groups into the maelstrom, diving to clear paths through the chaos. Below them, waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from the clouds. The sky became an inferno. Thunderbolts dove through tracer fire, guns blazing, metal screaming under pressure. One pilot, Lieutenant Donovan Smith, was hit twice but refused to bail out. If the engine's turning, he said over the radio. I'm not leaving her. He made it home barely. That day, despite catastrophic losses, the bombers reached their target. The German factory burned for 2 days. The Thunderbolts returned battered, bloodied, but victorious. When the mission report came in, it bore a single line that summed up the entire day. The Thunderbolts stayed until the last bomber was out of flak range. Chapter 7: A New Kind of Fear. In the aftermath of Ostersleben, Luftwaffe command realized something terrible. The Americans weren't breaking. Their losses only hardened them. The Thunderbolt squadrons kept coming. Faster, heavier, more coordinated. And now they had something the Germans didn't: replacement pilots, fuel, and time. But for the men in the cockpit, that knowledge was cold comfort. Every mission meant saying goodbye to someone who might never return. At the 56th Fighter Group's mess hall, silence often filled the space where laughter once lived. Gabreski would walk through the room, nodding to the new arrivals, boys barely out of flight school, and wonder which of them he'd be saluting next week. War had matured them all. The recklessness of 1943 was gone. What remained was discipline, resolve, and belief. Belief in the jug. Belief in each other. Belief that one day the thunder would end. Chapter 8: The Turning Tide. By spring 1944, the air war was shifting. With new long-range tanks, the P-47s could now reach beyond the Rhine, and a new fighter, the P-51 Mustang, was entering service to extend that reach even further. Many thought the Thunderbolts' days were numbered. But Zemke saw differently. The Mustang will go far, he said, but the jug will finish the fight. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Thunderbolts' mission changed. From escorting bombers to owning the ground. They became flying artillery, strafing trains, tanks, and convoys. The same aircraft that had once dueled in the high clouds now turned its fury earthward. The Luftwaffe was no longer the primary enemy. Now, the jug's target was the Nazi war machine itself. The sound of thunder no longer just echoed in the sky. It rolled across the earth, the prelude to liberation. End of section 4. The Thunderbolts' pilots had endured the crucible. They had bled, learned, and believed until belief became truth. Their faith had turned a doubted machine into a legend. And soon, that legend would descend upon Normandy, where the jug would prove that thunder could strike the ground. Section 5: Surviving Hell. Robert Johnson's Miracle. The sky above France was the color of steel, cold, hard, and merciless. It was June 26, 1943, and the war in the air was still young for the Americans. The 56th Fighter Group had only been in combat for a few months, flying the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. German pilots still laughed at it. They called it der fliegende Milchkarton, the flying milk carton. But that laughter would begin to fade on this day, when one man's survival would become legend. 1. The mission. At dawn, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson climbed into his P-47C, codenamed Half Pint. He was 23 years old, with boyish features and nerves of steel. His orders were simple: escort a formation of B-17 flying fortresses over northern France. The mission was supposed to be routine: sweep ahead of the bombers, clear the skies, and bring everyone home. But the Luftwaffe had plans of its own. As Johnson and his wingmen climbed to 27,000 feet, the world below disappeared beneath a carpet of cloud. Sunlight glared off the canopy. The air thinned, and far ahead, specks appeared, black dots growing larger, faster. Focke-Wulf 190s. 2. The attack. They came out of the sun, guns blazing. The formation scattered instantly. The air was alive with tracers, slicing like red needles through the blue. Johnson's Thunderbolt shuddered violently. Thud, thud, thud. As cannon shells ripped into his fuselage, a round exploded near the cockpit, showering him with fragments of plexiglass. Smoke filled the canopy. His right hand, slick with blood, slipped on the throttle. "God, not now," he whispered. He tried to roll over and dive, but the control stick wouldn't move. His elevator cables were severed. The P-47 was barely flying. a 10,000-pound coffin in the sky. Still, the engine roared on. 3. Alone and falling. The German fighters peeled away, believing the Thunderbolt was finished. Johnson's plane spun slowly, a wounded giant. He struggled to keep it level. Every muscle screamed. He was losing altitude fast, 5,000 feet per minute. The English Channel shimmered far away, a cold grave. He keyed his mic. Blue leader, this is Johnson. I'm hit. Controls gone trying to. Static. He was alone. 4. The Predator returns. Then, out of nowhere, a shadow crossed the sun. Johnson glanced up, and his heart froze. FW-190 was diving toward him, guns twinkling. The German pilot wasn't satisfied to let the Thunderbolt die on its own. He was coming to finish the job. The first burst slammed into the fuselage. Then another. The canopy rattled. Rounds chewed into the wings. Johnson ducked instinctively, sparks flying past his head. He could see the enemy clearly now. Silver goggles, a yellow nose marking, and the confident grin of a killer who thought this was sport. The German made pass after pass. 10, 15, 20 times, hammering the helpless Thunderbolt. Johnson counted every attack. His cockpit was riddled with holes. Fuel streamed from the wings. And yet, the P-47 refused to die. 5. The indestructible jug. Johnson's armor plating, that thick bathtub of steel surrounding the cockpit, had saved him. The .50-inch armor plate behind his head had absorbed several cannon shells. Each time the German came in, Johnson instinctively curled tighter in his seat, pressing himself against the armor. The FW-190 made another pass. Johnson felt the bullets smash into his right wing root. One tore through his radio, another clipped his oxygen hose. Smoke poured in. His vision blurred. He thought of his mother back home in Oklahoma. He thought of the girl who had written him last week, promising she'd wait. He closed his eyes. But the engine, that monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800, kept thundering. Somehow, through holes the size of fists, it still ran. The German couldn't believe it. 6. The duel ends. After nearly half an hour of relentless attack, the FW-190 pulled up beside Johnson's battered P-47. For a long, eerie moment, the two men flew side by side. The German pilot looked across the gap, shaking his head in disbelief. Johnson, his face blackened with oil and blood, met his gaze. Then, in a strange gesture, half salute, half acknowledgement, the German waved. A small, almost respectful tilt of the wing. And then he was gone. Johnson limped the Thunderbolt back toward England, barely holding altitude. The propeller was chewed, the fuselage shredded, the right wing torn. But the engine, that unstoppable R2800, still roared. After what felt like a lifetime, he crossed the channel and made a belly landing at his home base. The P-47 slid across the grass, sparks and dust flying. It stopped just short of the runway's end. Silence. Johnson opened the canopy and fell out onto the ground. 7. Counting the scars. When the crew examined his aircraft, they were stunned. 201 bullet holes. The Thunderbolt skin was ripped to ribbons. The canopy was shattered. The radio was gone. The tail was barely attached. But the engine still turned. The maintenance chief, speechless, ran a finger through one of the holes and looked up at Johnson. "Lieutenant," he said, "I don't know how the hell you're still alive." 8. The news spreads. Word spread across the airfields like wildfire. Pilots gathered to stare at the wreck that had somehow flown home. To the German aces who had mocked the P-47, the story was unbelievable. A machine that could take that kind of punishment and still return. For the first time, the Luftwaffe began to fear the jug. And for the American pilots, it was a revelation. They realized what they had in their hands. Not a flying milk bottle, but a flying fortress in its own right. Robert Johnson's story became legend overnight. 9. Aftermath and legacy. Johnson went on to score 27 aerial victories, becoming one of America's top aces. But he never forgot that day. Years later, he would write, "I was hit so many times that death should have come easy, but the jug wouldn't quit. She was alive, and as long as she lived, so did I. His crippled aircraft was towed to the edge of the field and left there as a reminder, a symbol of survival, resilience, and American engineering defiance. The mechanics gave her a new nickname, the Jug That Wouldn't Die. 10. The psychological shift. That single event rippled across Europe. German pilots began reporting Thunderbolts that would not go down. Some claimed they saw P-47s flying with entire control surfaces missing. The Luftwaffe began to change its tactics. They no longer underestimated the American fighter. They attacked only in numbers and even then, avoided head-on passes. The balance of the air war was shifting. From this moment onward, the Thunderbolt was no longer a joke. It was a juggernaut living up to its name. 11. The man behind the legend. Robert Johnson returned home after the war a quiet hero. He rarely boasted. When asked how he survived, he always gave the same answer. The P-47 saved me. She took everything they threw at her and brought me home. In a war defined by machines and death, Johnson's story was a testament to something deeper. The bond between a pilot and his aircraft, and the engineering miracle that could transform mockery into awe. 12. Transition to the next chapter. By the time Robert Johnson's miracle made headlines, the Republic engineers were already working on something new. A set of modifications that would make the Thunderbolt even deadlier. A new propeller, a refined engine, and new tactics would soon turn the sky into a storm of lead. The Luftwaffe had made one mistake already. They underestimated the Jug. They wouldn't live long enough to make that mistake again. Section 6. The turning point. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt could have ended in frustration, another overbuilt experiment that fell short of expectations. But by late 1943, everything began to change. From the factories of Farmingdale to the airfields of East Anglia, a transformation was underway, not just in the aircraft itself, but in the men who flew it. The Jug, as the pilots affectionately called it, was about to become something the Luftwaffe could no longer ignore or survive. 1. Lessons written in fire. Robert Johnson's survival story wasn't just a tale of luck. It was data. When the engineers at Republic Aviation heard what had happened, they demanded to see his aircraft. The wreckage was shipped back to the U.S., where every bullet hole, every dent, every fragment was studied. One engineer reportedly muttered, "She shouldn't have made it home." Another replied, "Then we'll make sure the next one always does." The Thunderbolt's thick armor had saved Johnson, but its performance issues had nearly killed him first. At high altitude, it struggled to climb fast enough to intercept German fighters. At low level, its massive frame bled speed in turns. Republic's design team, led by Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born genius behind the Jug, began revising every inch of the machine. They didn't want to change its soul. They wanted to unleash it. 2. Engineering the evolution. The biggest breakthrough came with a new propeller, the Curtiss electric paddle blade. The original narrow prop couldn't properly convert the R2800's immense horsepower into thrust. The new paddle blade design gripped the air like a giant claw, turning the Thunderbolt from a lumbering giant into a high-speed climber. Pilots described it like this: "The first time I throttled up with the new paddle prop, it felt like someone kicked me in the back. The Jug just leapt forward. Climb rate improved dramatically. Takeoffs were shorter. High-altitude performance became smoother and faster." Republic also reinforced the airframe, redesigned the supercharger ducts for better reliability, and added hardpoints for bombs and rockets, transforming the Jug from a pure fighter into a multi-role war machine. 3. The pilots adapt. The aircraft evolved, but so did the men. In the early days, Thunderbolt pilots often came from stateside training units that still used light aircraft. Many were young, inexperienced, and shocked by the sheer size of the Jug. By the winter of 1943, that was changing. Veterans like Hub Zemke, Francis Gabby Gabreski, and David Schilling, all of the legendary 56th Fighter Group, were developing new tactics that exploited the P-47's strengths. They stopped trying to outturn the Germans. They learned to outdive, outclimb, and outgun them. Hub Zemke drilled it into his men. "You don't dance with a Focke-Wulf. You crush it." Dive, fire, and climb away. Use your horsepower, use your thunder. 4. The birth of the Zemke fan. Zemke's innovation was tactical genius. Before, American fighter groups tended to fly in tight, rigid formations, relics of pre-war theory. That made them predictable. Zemke changed everything. He created a new formation called the Zemke fan. Instead of flying in a single mass, his squadrons would fan out in a wide arc ahead of the bomber stream. From that position, each element could hunt freely, diving out of the sun, hitting German interceptors before they ever reached the bombers. The tactic turned the Luftwaffe's own strategy against them. And the Thunderbolt, with its rugged engine and blistering dive speed, was the perfect weapon for it. 5. Baptism of fire, Schweinfurt-Regensburg. The first real test of these new tactics came during one of the most infamous missions of the war, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17, 1943. Hundreds of B-17 bombers crossed the channel in two massive waves, targeting Germany's aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at them. The 56th Fighter Group was assigned escort duty, but even with the new Thunderbolts, their range was limited. They could only go halfway before turning back. Still, the results were telling. When the German fighters swarmed, the P-47s dove like thunderbolts, literally, slashing through enemy formations with devastating speed. Their 8.50s ripped apart Bf-109s and Fw-190s in seconds. One pilot recalled, "It was like swinging a sledgehammer through glass. One burst, and they just came apart." The bombers suffered heavy losses, but the Thunderbolt had proven itself. When the Luftwaffe counted its dead that evening, it realized something new had entered the war. 6. The end of Luftwaffe arrogance. In 1942, German pilots joked that the Americans didn't know how to build fighters. By late 1943, they had stopped laughing. Reports from Luftwaffe intelligence units began noting the Thunderbolt's resilience and devastating firepower. One German ace described it as a monster that does not die. You shoot, and it keeps coming. The psychological tide was turning. For the first time, the Luftwaffe felt what it had once inflicted on others, fear. 7. The factories that roared. Behind every Thunderbolt in the air was a miracle of industry on the ground. Republic Aviation's plant in Farmingdale, Long Island, ran 24 hours a day. Thousands of workers, men and women, labored under roaring lights, riveting wings, fitting engines, and testing superchargers. Each completed P-47 was rolled out and blessed with chalk graffiti. To Berlin, for Bob, give 'em hell. Peak output, one Thunderbolt rolled off the line every 90 minutes. By war's end, Republic would build 15,683 of them. The German war machine, running on slave labor and dwindling fuel, could never match that scale. 8. New blood, new confidence. By early 1944, Thunderbolt pilots were flying with swagger. The 56th, 78th, and 352nd Fighter Groups became legends. Their airfields buzzed with life, propellers spinning, laughter over tin cups of coffee, the distant rumble of engines echoing like storm clouds. The old fear was gone. Now, when someone yelled, "Bandits!" over the radio, pilots didn't panic. They grinned. Where are they? Right below. Let's go give 'em thunder. Every mission, every victory, added to the myth. The Luftwaffe's elite, once untouchable, were being hunted down in their own skies. 9. The arrival of the D-series. Then came the P-47D, the definitive variant, larger, heavier, but far deadlier. Could carry 700 gallons of fuel with drop tanks, giving it the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. It also carried rockets and bombs, turning it into a true fighter bomber. The Germans had a new name for it now, Jabo, short for Jag Bomber. They would learn to fear that word. 10. Air superiority earned. The turning point wasn't one battle or one upgrade. It was 100 small victories stacking up, one after another. From 1943 onward, the Luftwaffe's veteran ranks began to thin. Every time they faced the Thunderbolt, more never came home. And every new American pilot who took to the air did so with better training, better equipment, and growing confidence that the jug would bring them back alive. By the start of 1944, the P-47 wasn't just surviving, it was dominating. 11. The roar that meant death. To German soldiers on the ground, the deep growl of the P-47's engine became an omen. When they heard it, they dove for cover because it usually meant death was seconds away. Its 8 machine guns could level a train in a single pass. Its bombs could annihilate tanks. Its rockets, nicknamed the Holy Moses, could shatter entire convoys. German troops called it der Donnerkeil, the Thunderbolt. The name was no longer a joke. It was prophecy. 12. Toward a new era. By spring 1944, even the most skeptical generals admitted the truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become one of the most powerful weapons of the war. Its transformation, from laughter to dominance, symbolized the entire American war effort. Slow to start, unstoppable once moving. The stage was now set for the Thunderbolt's greatest role. Not just in the skies, but on the ground, where it would rain destruction on the Wehrmacht itself. That would come next. Section 7. The fall of the Luftwaffe's confidence. For years, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies of Europe. From the smoking ruins of Warsaw to the cliffs of Dover, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs had seemed untouchable. But by late 1943, something had changed. German pilots who once mocked the slow, overweight American Thunderbolt were coming home pale and shaken, if they came home at all. They'd been hit by something new, something terrifying. A monster that shrugged off their bullets and tore them from the sky in return. 1. Cracks in the iron sky. The first signs of collapse weren't loud. They were subtle, whispers in Luftwaffe officers' messes, uneasy glances at briefing maps, reports marked vertraulich, confidential. At first, commanders dismissed them as bad luck or overconfidence. But soon the reports grew darker. Thunderbolt fighters show increasing aggression. High dive speed makes interception dangerous. Repeated failure to destroy targets, aircraft too durable. Each sentence was a dagger in the pride of a force that had once believed itself invincible. 2. The new American sky. Above the clouds, the balance of power had shifted. The Americans were flying higher, faster, farther. With the new P-47D and its drop tanks, Thunderbolts were escorting bombers deep into occupied Europe, places the Luftwaffe once considered safe territory. And when they arrived, they didn't just escort. They hunted. Entire squadrons of FW-190s scrambled to meet them, but each battle ended the same. The Germans attacked with precision, but the Thunderbolts attacked with momentum. Their .50 caliber guns unleashed storms of lead that shredded wings, fuselages, and egos. 3. The day confidence died. One mission, in particular, became infamous among German pilots. It was January 1944. A formation of P-47s from the 56 Fighter Group, led by Hub Zemke, crossed the channel to escort bombers near Brunswick. As the Americans approached, German radar operators scrambled 2 Gruppen of FW-190s to intercept. They expected the usual clumsy American planes, easy to outmaneuver. Instead, they found death waiting. Zemke's Thunderbolts swooped from above in perfect synchronization, diving at speeds near 500 miles per hour. So fast the German pilots barely had time to react. In just minutes, 7 FW-190s were down. The rest broke off and fled. One German pilot later told an interrogator, "It was not combat, it was slaughter." That day, for the first time, the Luftwaffe's command staff used a phrase they had never written before: moral collapse among pilots. For aces in denial. But not everyone accepted the truth easily. Luftwaffe aces, men like Adolf Galland, Gunther Rall, and Johannes Steinhoff, had built their reputations on mastery of the air. They couldn't believe that a new American brute could dethrone them. Galland once sneered in a briefing, "The P-47 looks like it should be pulling a plow, not fighting a war." But months later, after reviewing combat reports, even Galland admitted in private, "We underestimated them. Terribly." The Thunderbolt's combination of speed, firepower, and resilience was rewriting the rules of air combat. 5. The psychological war. By early 1944, Luftwaffe morale was eroding faster than their fuel reserves. Pilots dreaded the deep, thundering growl of Pratt and Whitney engines. Ground crews began calling it der Donner, the thunder. It wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. One German ground soldier wrote in his diary, "When we hear the thunderbolts, we hide. There is no defense. The sound grows and grows until it feels like the sky itself is falling." The once feared Luftwaffe was now afraid to fly. 6. Death by industry. Even as German pilots fought desperately to hold their skies, American factories kept feeding the storm. While the Luftwaffe struggled to replace every aircraft they lost, Republic Aviation and its subcontractors were building thousands more Thunderbolts, faster than the Germans could shoot them down. By the start of 1944, the Allies had more fighters in England than the entire Luftwaffe had left in Europe. Every day, new pilots arrived, fresh-faced, nervous, and armed with the latest P-47s. Every day, the Luftwaffe's aces fell, replaced by terrified teenagers with less than 100 hours of flight time. The Thunderbolt didn't just outfight Germany's best. It outlasted them. 7. The battle for air supremacy. The turning point came in February 1944. Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. The Allies launched a relentless bombing campaign targeting German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense. For 6 straight days, the sky above Germany burned, and the Thunderbolts were there, thousands of them, diving, strafing, killing. Everywhere the Luftwaffe appeared, the Jugs followed, hammering them in the air and on the ground. When it ended, Germany had lost over 600 aircraft in a single week. The Americans lost fewer than 250, and every one replaced within days. The Luftwaffe never recovered. 8. The fall of the masters. By the spring of 1944, the great German aces, the ones who had terrified Europe for years, were dying or captured. The sky that had once belonged to them was now a battlefield they could barely survive. When Galland flew over northern France, he saw the evidence himself. Endless contrails of bombers and escorts, horizon to horizon. He later said, "The American sky was like an ocean. We were drowning in it." For the first time, German pilots began avoiding combat altogether. They flew only when ordered, and many prayed not to return. The Luftwaffe, once the sharpest sword of the Reich, was now breaking apart under the weight of exhaustion, fear, and fire. 9. The rise of the Jug aces. While the Luftwaffe fell, new American legends rose. Gabby Gabreski, Dave Schilling, Robert Johnson, and Hub Zemke each racked up dozens of kills. They became the faces of a new kind of air war, confident, relentless, unstoppable. Gabreski once joked, "They said the Jug couldn't fight. I guess nobody told the Germans." By mid-1944, he was the top-scoring American ace in Europe. The Thunderbolt, once mocked, now inspired awe even among its enemies. Captured German pilots often asked one question first. Was it the Jug that got me? 10. The crumbling front. Below the clouds, German airfields became graveyards. Wrecked Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lined the runways. Twisted metal scorched black by the Thunderbolt's strafing runs. Every hangar, every fuel depot, every truck was a target. The P-47s attacked with terrifying precision. Ground crews begged for anti-aircraft cover, but there weren't enough guns. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing battles, it was losing the ability to fight. 11. Fear by name. By now, the Germans had a phrase for it, Thunderbolt syndrome. It wasn't official, it was whispered. Pilots spoke of Thunderbolts that appeared out of nowhere, diving at impossible angles, spitting streams of bullets that lit up the sky like fire from heaven. One Luftwaffe survivor said years later, "You didn't see them until it was too late. They came like thunder, and then nothing." The psychological toll was catastrophic. Every new pilot took off already haunted. 12. A dying empire of wings. By June 1944, on the eve of D-Day, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded half its fleet. Replacement pilots were barely trained. Radar stations were in ruins. And above it all, the Thunderbolt ruled, in squadrons, in waves, in storms. What began as a punchline had become a prophecy fulfilled. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter anymore. It was a symbol of power, persistence, and inevitability. The Luftwaffe's confidence had not just cracked. It had collapsed. 13. Transition to the next chapter. By the summer of 1944, the war in the air was effectively over. The Luftwaffe could no longer challenge the Allies. But the Thunderbolt's greatest mission was still ahead, the fight on the ground. Soon, it would trade dogfights for dive bombing, hunting trains, tanks, and soldiers across France. It would become the storm on the earth, not just the sky. The next chapter of the Jug's legend, Storms of Lead, was about to begin. Section 8. Storms of Lead. The sky had been won. Now it was time to bring the thunder to the ground. 1. D-Day's Silent Guardians. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy exploded with chaos. Gunfire, artillery, the screams of men and metal. Above them, invisible through the clouds, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts circled like hawks waiting to strike. Their pilots had been briefed. Keep the beaches clean. Nothing moves inland without permission. From first light to the last flicker of dusk, the Jugs, as the pilots affectionately called their machines, dove again and again. Every German column, every truck, every whisper of movement on a road became a target. The P-47's new role was brutal and direct. No longer hunting aircraft, it was hunting everything else. With a single pull of the trigger, 8.50 caliber Brownings unleashed a torrent of bullets so thick it seemed the sky itself turned solid. A German officer later described it with shaking hands. It was like standing beneath a waterfall made of fire. 2. The birth of the Jabo legend. German soldiers soon gave the Thunderbolt a new name, Jabo, short for Jag-Bomber, fighter bomber. But among troops on the ground, it carried another meaning entirely, doom. Convoys that moved by daylight were suicide. Trains that dared to run were found later as twisted skeletons of blackened steel. When American pilots heard the word Jabo, they grinned. When German infantry heard it, they hid. One German diary from the Normandy front reads, "When the Jabos come, even the bravest freeze. They arrive with the sound of rolling thunder, and then everything disappears." The P-47 had become more than a weapon. It was a psychological phenomenon, a storm with wings. 3. From fighter to bomber. The transformation was astonishing. Engineers at Republic Aviation rearmed the P-47 for ground attack. 2 500-pound bombs beneath the wings. A 150-gallon drop tank for range. 8 machine guns, each capable of firing 13 rounds per second. At full load, the Thunderbolt could unleash nearly 4,000 pounds of death in a single pass. Pilots learned new tactics. Steep diving attacks at 45 degrees, skipping rockets into bridges, strafing trains with surgical precision. They called it tank busting. The Jug could rip open a Panzer's engine deck, ignite its fuel, and leave it burning like a torch. Captain Gerald Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group once said, "You didn't just see destruction, you felt it. The ground shook. The air smelled like hot metal and oil. You knew you were changing the battle below." 4. The sky's new symphony. The Allied soldiers on the ground learned to love the sound of thunderbolts. To them, it meant safety. To the enemy, it meant annihilation. When infantry columns were pinned down by machine gun nests or tanks, they called the Jug pilots through radio. "Rover Red, this is Blue Dog. We're marked with smoke. Bring the rain." Moments later, the sky tore open. P-47 screamed in from the clouds, guns blazing, bombs whistling. After the attack, the silence was deafening, except for the faint echo of thunder rolling away. 5. Operation Cobra breaking the wall. July 1944. Normandy had become a quagmire. Every hedge, every village a fortress. General Omar Bradley's army was stuck, bleeding against the German lines. The breakthrough would come not from the ground, but from the air. Operation Cobra began on July 25th. Thousands of American bombers dropped their loads on the German front near St. Lo. Then came the Thunderbolts. Waves of P-47s dove through the smoke, strafing anything that moved. Tanks, trucks, even trees that looked suspiciously alive. For 2 days, the jugs turned the battlefield into a wasteland. When the dust settled, the German defenses had ceased to exist. Bradley's troops advanced, and the road to Paris opened. The Allied breakout from Normandy was paved in bomb craters and bullet holes, courtesy of the Thunderbolt. 6. Jabo fever. By late summer, German morale was collapsing. Not from defeat in battle, but from exhaustion and terror. A new term appeared in Wehrmacht medical reports: Jabo fever. Jabo fever. Soldiers suffered panic attacks at the sound of distant engines. Entire convoys abandoned their vehicles when they heard the droning rumble of thunderbolts overhead. An SS report from August 1944 reads, "The enemy air superiority has broken our ability to maneuver. Even small groups of Jabos can paralyze entire divisions." In psychological terms, the Luftwaffe's terror had been replaced by America's thunder. 7. The machine that wouldn't die. The P-47 wasn't invincible, but it came close. Could take punishment that would tear most planes apart. Pilots returned with holes the size of dinner plates in their wings, engines leaking oil, and control cables shredded. Yet somehow, they made it home. Robert Johnson's earlier experience, surviving over 200 bullet holes, was no longer unique. One squadron log from the 9th Air Force recorded, "Pilot returned safely. Plane missing half its rudder. Recommended paint change, to include more metal." Ground crews joked that the Thunderbolt wasn't an airplane, it was a flying anvil. 8. Europe burns. As the Allies swept across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the Thunderbolts followed. They destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 68,000 trucks. Each mission had a purpose: to choke Germany's arteries, to cut off supplies, to make retreat impossible. A single P-47 squadron could erase a German division's logistics in one day. The Wehrmacht's once precise movements became chaos. Fuel shortages, broken bridges, abandoned armor, the jug was everywhere. One German tank commander, captured near Aachen, confessed, "We were not defeated by men. We were defeated by machines in the sky." 9. The pilot's perspective. For the men flying the jugs, the experience was both exhilarating and haunting. They saw war at its most intimate. Not duels at 20,000 feet, but death at treetop level. Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski wrote, "You could see their faces sometimes, the soldiers diving for cover, the tanks exploding, the trucks on fire. It wasn't heroism. It was survival. Each mission was a blur of speed, smoke, and noise. Pilots came back trembling, their flight suits soaked in sweat and oil. But they went up again every day until there was nothing left to destroy." 10. Allies on the ground. To the soldiers below, the Thunderbolt became a legend. They painted its silhouette on helmets. They cheered when it appeared. Some even prayed to it. One infantryman in the 2nd Armored Division said, "When the jugs came, we stood up and waved like idiots, because we knew we'd live another day." In every Allied advance, from St. Lo to the Siegfried Line, the jug was there, roaring above the columns, erasing resistance. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't graceful. But it was effective. 11. The industrial storm. Behind this fury was the silent engine of American industry. Factories in New York, Indiana, and Connecticut produced Thunderbolts faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. While Germany struggled to repair airfields under bombing raids, the U.S. shipped completed aircraft across the Atlantic in crates, one landing every few hours in England. The numbers told the story. 15,683 Thunderbolts built. More than any other American fighter in World War II. Mass production had become a weapon more powerful than genius. 12. The toll of victory. But even as the Allies advanced, the cost was immense. Hundreds of pilots never returned. Anti-aircraft fire, flak, filled the skies like black flowers. Pilots learned to recognize its rhythm, the cough of cannons, the blossoms of smoke that grew closer and closer. They called it the Deadly Garden. Many jugs vanished in those clouds, their fates sealed in silence. Others limped home, their pilots wounded, their planes scorched. War gave them glory and took it back without warning. 13. Into Germany. By late 1944, the front had crossed into the Reich itself. Thunderbolts hunted retreating columns through the forests of the Ardennes and the plains of the Rhineland. Their machine guns tore through convoys fleeing eastward. Rail junctions exploded in chains of fire that stretched for miles. When the Germans launched their desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, it was again the Thunderbolts that answered. Even in the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, the P-47s flew through sleet and snow to strike the advancing panzers. One American pilot recalled, "We couldn't see much, just shadows on white. But when we opened fire, the shadows burned." The skies above the Ardennes belonged to the Jug. 14. Fear made flesh. To German soldiers retreating through the wreckage, the Thunderbolt became something beyond human comprehension. They spoke of it as if it were alive, a beast that hunted sound before sight. A roar, a flash, a wall of bullets. A Luftwaffe ground observer summarized it grimly. The Americans have given thunder a body. 15. Transition, the edge of the end. By early 1945, the Thunderbolt's work was nearly done. The Luftwaffe was shattered, the Wehrmacht in retreat, and the roads of Germany littered with the ruins of its army. But the story of the Jug wasn't over yet. Soon it would fight over the Rhine, support the final Allied push, and witness the end of the Reich it had helped destroy. The last battles of the war, and the legacy of the P-47, awaited beyond the river. The next and final chapter begins. Final section, Thunder over the ruins. The war was ending. You could feel it, not in speeches or orders, but in the silence that followed the thunder. Europe, once ablaze, now smoldered beneath a sky that the P-47 Thunderbolt had helped conquer. For 2 relentless years, it had carried the storm, and now, as victory approached, the storm began to fade. But not before one last roar. 1. Winter 1945, the dying fire. By January 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, was a ghost. Its airfields were graveyards of twisted metal. Its pilots, exhausted teenagers with more fear than fuel. Yet the Thunderbolts kept flying. Day after day, mission after mission. Even when there was nothing left to shoot, they patrolled, watching, waiting, ensuring the end would come with no surprises. The cold was merciless. Pilots scraped frost from their cockpits, their breath freezing on oxygen masks. Engines coughed, sputtered, then growled back to life, the familiar music of the Jug. To the men in those cockpits, it was no longer about glory or records. It was about finishing what they'd started. 2. Across the Rhine. In March 1945, the Rhine River, Germany's last natural defense, became the next target. Bridges were vital. If they stood, the Wehrmacht could retreat. If they fell, the Reich would be cut in two. And so the Thunderbolts came. At dawn, hundreds of P-47s roared eastward, their wings heavy with bombs and rockets. They attacked railways, convoys, fuel depots, bridges, anything that could move men or machines. One mission report from the 9th Air Force read simply, "Objective: prevent movement. Result: nothing moves." When the Allies reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the only crossing still standing, Thunderbolts circled above, holding the sky. They strafed German counterattacks, silenced artillery, and bombed roads behind enemy lines. Within a week, Allied armor was pouring across the Rhine. The heart of Germany was open. 3. The last Luftwaffe. The final air battles of the war were strange, desperate, one-sided duels between old veterans and new machines. The Luftwaffe had a few surprises left. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything the Allies had, capable of outrunning even the Jug. But speed wasn't enough. The Thunderbolts learned to catch the jets as they landed, their engines vulnerable, their runways exposed. Many Me-262s were destroyed before they ever left the ground. In one encounter, a P-47 pilot dove through a flak barrage, firing on a jet moments before it took off, his rounds slicing through its fuel line. The Me-262 erupted in flames, rolling into the trees. The age of the jet had arrived, but too late to save Germany. 4. Death of a Sky Empire. By April 1945, there was no Luftwaffe left to fight. The P-47's missions turned from combat to mercy, reconnaissance, supply drops, and the destruction of what remained of the Reich's military infrastructure. But even then, the danger lingered. Flak gunners, desperate and defiant, still fired from hidden positions. Each black burst in the sky was a reminder that the war wasn't over. Not yet. One pilot wrote in his log, "We've bombed everything that can burn. Now we fly over ashes." The air smelled of spring and smoke. Cities that had once defined civilization, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, lay in ruin, their outlines traced by the shadows of circling aircraft. The sky belonged to no one, only to history. 5. The Final Sortie. April 25, 1945. The 9th Air Force launched one of its last large-scale missions. A formation of Thunderbolts, the same kind that had once been mocked as flying milk bottles, crossed into Bavaria to attack retreating German columns. They encountered almost no resistance, just convoys of trucks, wagons, and soldiers trudging toward surrender. Major Robert "Punchy" Powell, flying lead, called off the attack halfway through. He saw the white flags on the ground, handkerchiefs, bedsheets, torn shirts. He keyed his mic. "Boys, they've had enough. Let's take her home." That was the last major mission flown by the Thunderbolt in Europe. The storm had done its work. 6. The day the guns went silent. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Across Europe, the guns fell silent. The soldiers cheered. The people wept. And the skies, for the first time in 6 years, were clear. At their airfields in England, France, and Belgium, the pilots of the P-47 stood beside their aircraft, their machines blackened, scarred, patched a dozen times over. They touched the metal, the rivets, the bullet holes that had brought them home again and again. Some laughed. Some cried. Some just stared at the horizon. Colonel Hub Zemke, leader of the 56th Fighter Group, one of the Thunderbolt's great champions, said simply, "The Jug got us here. She never let us down." In that moment, every sneer, every insult, every joke about its size or speed vanished into history. The Jug had earned her name and her immortality. 7. Counting the thunder. The numbers were staggering. By war's end, the P-47 had flown over 746,000 sorties, more than any other Allied fighter. It had destroyed 3,752 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands on the ground. From mockery to myth, the transformation was complete. The P-47 had become more than a machine. It was proof that persistence could outlast arrogance, that resilience could defeat brilliance, and that the industrial heart of a free nation could overpower tyranny itself. 10. The sky after the storm. The war ended, but the echoes of the Thunderbolt remained. In the years that followed, its pilots scattered across the world. Some became airline captains, others farmers, engineers, fathers, grandfathers. They rarely spoke of what they'd seen, but when they did, their voices carried a reverence few could understand, because they knew what it meant to fly through hell and come back, to watch history unfold from 30,000 feet, and to realize you were the instrument shaping it. The Jug faded into museums and airshows, its massive frame now gleaming under peaceful skies. Children looked up and pointed. Old men looked up and remembered. 11. Epilogue, the sound of thunder. If you stand near one today, if you hear its engine start, you'll understand. The deep, rolling growl of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 still shakes the ground, just as it did 80 years ago. That sound carries memory, carries ghosts, carries victory, because the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter plane. It was the roar of a nation that refused to bow. It was the promise that no tyranny, no empire, No arrogance could withstand the will of free men united under the same sky. The Germans laughed at it once. They never laughed again. As the last thunderbolts fade into history, one truth remains. When thunder rolls, freedom flies.